In the previous tutorial, you learned how to review baseline data for completion and accuracy. This tutorial will focus on reviewing daily ABCs and weekly intervention data for accuracy and completion. Before I begin, let me remind you of the quickest and easiest way you can check whether or not your tracking for daily ABCs and interventions are up to date on Encore. Remember that when you go into your student tracking, for each student you can see the saved indicator for each week of tracking for which you updated both the daily ABCs and the interventions. If you have a general sense of when you started working with each of your focus list youth, you can quickly go and look to see each week since you started supporting that youth has been saved. If it doesn't say saved, even if you think you tracked for that week, it is not the system and you should go into that week and see what's going on. Perhaps you entered interventions but forgot to press Save Daily ABCs because the student was present all week and had no behavior referrals or course performance updates to make. Remember that Encore sets the default attendance to presence and default behavior referrals to 0. However, if you did physically save daily ABCs, none of that information is captured. For this tutorial, I have selected 4 students to look at. I did this using the filter feature. Following baseline data is the current month's ABC data. Here you see the number of instructional days that have occurred this month since you last saved ABCs and interventions on Encore. You can see that students Ashley, Daffy, and Jamal are up to date. There have been 16 instructional days in November. Student Olivia has a 0 because no daily ABCs or weekly interventions have been saved on Encore during the month of November, perhaps longer. This alerts you that you are behind with tracking and need to go back and update Olivia's ABCs and weekly interventions. Moving along the columns, you see that Ashley had 2 absences. Daffy had 3. Then you can see the attendance rate. Ashley was at school 87.5% of the time in November. Next you see tardies and on-time rate. Daffy was on time to school 92.31% of the time. The last 2 columns show how many interventions each student received in November and the duration in minutes of those interventions. Remember that at a minimum, focus list students should be receiving at least 1 intervention per week. If 16 instructional days have passed, that means that there have been just over 3 weeks of school. So the 3 or 4 interventions that Ashley and Daffy received is on track. Jamal's 2 interventions and Olivia's 0 interventions are off track. If you have students on your focus list that receive less of your time simply because they have an attendance issue and are present at your site or school less, consider other check-in types of interventions, such as calls home to see what's going on. This is something you can record and will keep you on track to a minimum of 1 intervention a week. Your youth success team and site supervisor should also be resources to you in determining what supports each of your focus list students need. On the other hand, if Jamal and Olivia have been present at school and you haven't supported them in a while, this report alerts you that you need to either spend more time with these students or catch up on your tracking and record the time you are spending with them more accurately. This next section is attendance data from the student start date up until today. A note for clarity. This report was pulled November 23rd, 12 weeks after the September 1st service start date. If you began to support students on September 1st, there will be approximately 55 instructional days between September 1st and November 30th at host sites in Minneapolis Public Schools, St. Paul Public Schools, and Duluth Public Schools. You can see this demonstrated with student Daffy. We don't expect that the majority of focus list students will have September 1st start dates, as Promise Fellows were just beginning their service and weren't trained on their data tracking responsibilities until the last week of September or the first week in October. Therefore, start dates around the end of September or the first week of October are acceptable for your early focus list students. A student with a late September start date would have approximately 35 instructional days. You can see this demonstrated with student Ashley. It will be helpful to have your site's calendar easily accessible as you review number of instructional days. If you hadn't already noted that Olivia's data was behind, you would note it in this section because her start date is September 14th and she only has 24 instructional days. Think about the start date and where we are in the year now to help gauge how many instructional days there will be. If a number seems too low, you're going to have to input some data. As a second frame of reference, you can see that Jamal's start date is September 21st and that he has 45 instructional days. Since Olivia's start date is earlier than Jamal's, she should have more instructional days. Again, most students who are on your focus list will have start dates mid to late September or early October. Moving along, we see intervention start to date totals. Remember that every student on your focus list should be receiving at least one intervention per week. Look at the start date and see how many instructional days each student has. If you're typically serving at your site 5 days a week, ask yourself if there has been at least one intervention per week. We already noted that Jamal is behind in interventions for the month of November, and we see that again here. Jamal has 7 interventions but has a start date 9 weeks ago. That lets you know that Jamal needs more support. Again, you can see that Livia is low. Her interventions need to be updated. Finally, there is the intervention by type breakdown. You can see that Daffy is the only student who hasn't had any service or leadership interventions. That lets you know that that's an area you may need to begin planning for Daffy. You can also see that Jamal has had 0 in-school support interventions. If you serve at a community-based site, this could be a possibility, and you may need to work with your youth success team to plan ways to connect Jamal to a caring adult during school-time hours for support. This goes both ways. If you are a school-based Promise Fellow and you notice most of your interventions happen in school, work with your youth success team, other Promise Fellows, and IPN Fellows to help connect your youth to potential community resources for out-of-school time activities that may benefit the student. Once you finish reviewing attendance and interventions and have made the corrections in Encore, you can use the same process to review the quality of your data. You will also be able to use this data to measure the progress your youth make and to plan for future interventions.